Okay, I just want to welcome you all to the Mental Ill Health and Co-occurring Issues Explored Workshop Part 2. And as you know, I'm Bronwyn Williams. I'm the Eastern Mental Health Service Coordination Alliance Coordinator. And today, on behalf of all of our presenters, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet virtually. And we pay respect to Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging, and to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us online today. We welcome and celebrate diversity at EMSCA as we reflect the variety of cultures and communities we serve. Our Alliance strives for true collaborative practice and a spirit of inclusivity for all. EMSCA recognises that poorer health outcomes are associated with experiences of discrimination and marginalisation, and we challenge inequities in the development and delivery of health and community services. EMSCA recognises those individuals and their supporters who have a lived experience of mental ill health and the important contribution that they make to the development and delivery of health and community services. You'll have the details of the Slido application. So to access Slido, simply search for Slido in your Google or your browser, on your phone, tablet or computer. And once you reach the Slido page, you don't need to sign up or anything. Just put in the code MHACIE, and you should be able to see the polls and Q&A functions, or you can simply scan this QR code that's on the screen right now. And in the Q&A, you can ask a question at any time during the event, and we'll be prioritising Q&A today. So you should have time to ask some questions. You might like somebody else's question, and that will prioritise the question and push it up to be answered. And I'll be moderating the Q&A and activating the polls. So our first poll is designed to really reflect the complexities that you're all dealing with and how supported you feel. We'll get to that in a moment. Okay, so today's presenters, this is a two-part series, and you'll have the details in your booklet, which I emailed you last Wednesday. And I'll be sending you this slide pack this afternoon. We're recording today's session, and this will be available on the EMSCA webpage later in the week. But please note that the MACNI session is not being recorded. And we have 3 new sessions for you today covering the topics of complex support needs with Belinda Henry of MACNI, gambling and mental ill health with Laurel and Kevin of Gamblers Health, and family violence and mental health with Pauline, Rosie and Kate. Today is sure to provide a rich experience of understanding how to work with complexities. So let's have a look at our first poll today. How supported do you feel in your current role when managing safety concerns with people who have complex support needs? And so I'm just going to escape, and we're going to go to this screen, and you'll be able to see the results of the poll so far. So quite a few people logged in, 7 people. If we can all have a go, that'd be great. I'd hate anyone to miss out on the Slido opportunity. It's really a great way to stay engaged in this workshop. It's also a great way to see how everyone else is traveling with it. And remembering it's really very private. There's no identification of any of you in this polling process. So you can be completely honest and nobody will ever know. But it's really great to get this kind of live polling going. So we can see that, 41% of you feel very supported, some fairly supported, some barely supported, and there's a couple of people perhaps that never work with people who have complex support needs. Terrific. You can keep answering the poll as you get more familiar with the Slido. And certainly because it is our Q&A function today, we'd really love you to be in the Slido for the whole session. If you're having any difficulty and you've been logging in and QRing all this time with COVID, all you have to do is pop your camera on the screen here and you can get straight in. Lovely. All right, thanks for that. Now we might just return to our slides. So here's a list of the event crew for today. And as we did last week, we break into groups. We've assigned staff to facilitate the discussions, and you'll be assigned to rooms at 3 points in today's webinar. When this occurs, you'll not need to move yourself at all. Just allow Tom to move you around and stay in the breakout rooms until the session concludes. And can I please encourage everyone to make sure your camera is on when you're in a breakout session, unless you're having extraordinary issues at your end. And please be present for discussion so that the group process is maximised today. All right. And just another reminder of the key local shared care practices. You can find these in your event booklet as Appendix A, and also by going to the EMSCA webpage. Share them with your colleagues as we raise awareness of the importance of a shared approach to working with people, particularly those who have complex support needs. All of these practices will make working with complex issues more doable. Okay, so one last poll before we go to our first session today. When approaching complexity in your work, what would you like more support with? I'm just going to activate that poll now as we escape there and pull this one upwards. There we go. When approaching complexity in your work, what would you like more support with? So some of you indicated that you had good support at this time. This is obviously a bit harder to answer. I encourage our facilitators to jump into. Managing risk, great. We've got one brave person that's put something in. Oh, managing high risk, okay, similar. Early intervention, yeah. Safety and risk are coming up strongly. Clarity. Consultation. Okay, so that might be about communication and having the right kind of consultation support. Quite a few people are resonating with the idea of consultation. Now, that could be about a lot of things, whether it's about having a suitable secondary consultation when you're managing something, an area of complexity that you're not fully across. Consultation could be about being able to communicate with other parties to the care team. Debriefing, accountability, referral pathways, escalating to tertiary services. Yeah, that can be pretty tricky, hey? Crisis management. Certainly safety and risk are coming up as common words throughout this. And a holistic approach. Lower caseloads, yeah, having the time to really do the job that you'd like to do. Self-care. Fantastic, thanks guys. So consultations come up as our strongest word there. But as I said, there's a lot of safety and risk in the surrounding area there. Okay, well, I think it's just about time to introduce Belinda to you. So I'm just going to come back to our presentation. So Belinda Henry is a complex needs coordinator with the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing in inner eastern Melbourne. And Belinda has been working in the complex needs and MACNI area since 2009 and she's very skilled in understanding and navigating the service system. I'm going to stop the recording at this point, Belinda, or pause the recording. Zoom recording. Thanks, Laurel. I'm just going to give you remote control now to. There you go.
Thank you, Bronwyn. Thank you for that introduction for Kevin and I. Can everyone hear and see me okay?
I'm just going to pin you.
I can't see myself, which is always a little bit disconcerting, but as long as everyone can hear and see me, then that's fine. Oh, perfect. Thank you for that. Yeah, thank you for having us. Really, I wanted to create a little bit of a dialogue around gambling and clients that may be presenting with mental health and gambling in their world and how to work within that space. Oh, I'm just saying, I'm not sure if it doesn't look like I'm able to actually go to the next slide. Oh, there we go. So why are we here today? It's my thought that a piece of the puzzle is missing when gambling isn't taken into account. When a client's presenting with the conflicts that they're experiencing, a large piece of that puzzle isn't taken into account when gambling isn't factored in. I've used the word gambling lens, and really I'm using it in a similar way to when we talk about trauma informed practice. Really, it's about using a gambling lens when gambling is identified as being in someone's world, and really how to identify harm and how to work effectively with someone experiencing harm. Not you. You may need to go to the next slide for me, Bronwyn. Sorry, it doesn't seem like I've got control. Thank you. So what we know that help seeking is delayed. Those that are experiencing high amounts of gambling harm, they're often presenting to other services first. So that might be food banks, it might be financial support services, it might be domestic violence services, it might be primary mental health, it might be within the justice system as well. And I've just put here why it's not so easy to actually identify that gambling is a part of someone's world and how they're presenting. I think with gambling, you don't have the same physical cues necessarily like you might with other addictions, that kind of the intoxication or being able to see substance use. It can go hidden or be kind of masked, I guess, for years. So it's not always easy to identify. Ooh. Have we jumped forward? No, that's okay. One of the key messages and one of the key things that I've found in working in this space is that gambling really affects one's ability to participate and thrive in society on a psychosocial and economic level. So one of my clients, she's a teacher. She's able to pay her bills, but she's living week to week, and how that affects her ability to participate in society and her mental health. An example would be that living pay to pay. She's had colleagues or friends that have asked her to go out on a Friday or to spend time together. She's not able to. She finds that she's creating excuses because she doesn't have the funds to actually engage with them. So that it really creates a system where people can become very isolated. There's high amounts of shame, which affects their mental well-being, and it also can strengthen the connection to gambling as a way to self-regulate those feelings as well. Psychological distress, I'll jump to the next slide in a minute, but psychological distress, there was a Swedish study, longitudinal, and it found that mortality from gambling was 15 times higher than the general population. Studies closer to home, I guess. Studies that have been a little bit closer, figures have been around, have I got it here? I think it's one in 5 people attempt suicide in the general population that experience gambling harm compared to the general population. And there is huge amounts of psychological distress when it comes to gambling. People can find themselves in a space of hiding their gambling for years from their partner, and then spending a whole month's worth of rent in a night. So there's huge amounts of psychological distress. I've just put here increased risk, so suicide risk, connections with alcohol and substance use. So it's an important piece of the puzzle because we know that betting behaviour, gambling behaviour, if someone is using a substance or they're using alcohol, there's a change in the betting behaviour that occurs. So there might be a greater amount of money that's used. If they've had a gambling activity and they've experienced significant loss or distress, gambling or drugs may I guess, fill a role in trying to self-soothe. So it's important to recognise the connections there. The next slide, it's quite wordy, but really it's just looking at the framework around harms and how gambling can affect the whole system of someone's life. I guess what I haven't mentioned might be so much around crimes being committed, unstable employment, job losses, for example. If we have a look at the next slide, this is just around how I see gambling, really. So I see problematic gambling as an intense relationship. It's a consuming relationship that can build over time. And it's not intentional. It can start in quite a innocent way in terms of a sense of enjoyment. There might be early wins, but over the years, it can lead to scattered and weakened connections and other areas of a person's life. So often gambling, it's not the intention, but it can become the priority or the primary relationship in someone's life, affecting their connection to friends and family. Often it can be hard for someone to be fully present when they're around others, when they might be consumed with the thought around a race that's on, how the race might be going, when they can next place a bet, or trying to soothe the urge that they're feeling. We go to the next slide. Really, it's around, I guess it's a motivational interviewing approach for those that are familiar with that modality. So it's just around when I'm working with the client, and it's a bit of a framework around, I guess, acknowledging that reluctancies and ambivalences around changing gambling habits are part of the process and expected and really normal. So there can be an internal conflict around part of a person may be happy and enjoy gambling, serving a function, but also there's harm being experienced. There's often I've got the word there, cognitive dissonance. There's often a cognitive dissonance for people that's experienced. If I think of my client who I mentioned briefly before, the one who's a teacher, she speaks about a part of her role at work, feeling really competent, feeling really responsible, but this other part that gambles and feels out of control, and that it goes against all her logic and her values, and it's hard to understand and actually articulate to others. There's often a fear around change. So a fear of what will life look like without gambling. I've got clients that gambling has been in their life for perhaps half of their life. A lot of their connections, friendship groups are concentrated around gambling. So this next slide is really about what to consider when working in this space. So, connections and how gambling may relate to a client's presenting symptoms and conflict. So, an example would be we're really lucky to be able to work with Gambling Minds. So, it's part of the Victorian statewide mental health and gambling harm service. It's part of Alfred Hospital and Alfred Health. So we're able to refer clients for psychiatrist assessment, for example, occupational health support as well. I've spoken to one of the social workers there, and she spoke about a client who was on the inpatient ward and who would present and spoke about not taking their medication. It was later discovered that this client was experiencing gambling harm, and one of the factors in them actually taking their medication was the funds, and not actually having the funds to be able to afford that. So if gambling wasn't taken into account, it's not in the picture, if it's not asked, if it's not identified, we don't get a clear picture of what's really going on for a client. So I've just put there briefly the internal and the external factors maintaining the relationship to gambling, and why coordinated care is really critical, really. When we often know for clients that when they've got significant gambling debt, it's a bit like a monkey on the shoulder, and it just adds layers around actually stopping gambling, because there's a vicious cycle around if I just win, if I have a big win, I'll be able to pay off the debt. So often referring to financial counselling services, them liaising with debt collectors, which is contributing to high amounts of psychological distress. That can be really critical as well. Okay, just having a look at the time. How are we going for time? I've just got a few notes that I've put down there. What to consider when working in this space. So that's just the stage of change model. So really working where a client is at. I think one of the key things is identifying the function of gambling for the client. What need is it fulfilling around loneliness, excitement? It can be around a sense of satisfaction for people as well. The internal and the external factors, emotional dysregulation, the cycle of debt, chasing losses, and harm reduction. So even before, I guess our services that Kevin and I provide might be looking at some of the deeper issues around gambling, what's keeping that attachment. But there's a lot of harm reduction practical strategies as well. Just around, I guess, someone needs time, access, and money to gamble, and what can be put in place to restrict that. I will hand over to Kevin, who's going to give a little bit of provide more of a scope around gambling in Australia and during the lockdown, as well as a case study, which really looks at gambling and its complexities and how it trickles down within housing and a range of other areas. So I'll hand it over to Kevin.
Thank you, Narelle. Thanks for giving this overview about our service, about how we provide support to the clients, and also a little bit about the gambling mind of the clients. So I'll take over here, talk about gambling during the lockdowns, because I guess we see a huge transitions from 2 years ago to right now, how people are experiencing gambling harm in Australia specifically. So firstly, the changes to gambling venues and habits. Because of the past 2 years, there was a long period of time that the TAB venues or all the pokies, Azhar Club are actually closed. So that has changed a lot of the gambling behavior, the routine that some people may have previously, that they socialize in the RSL club, that they go to pokies venue every weekend, or they go to the TAB venues while the race and match is happening. So all that has been changed. So it brings some pros and cons to some people's life. For some people, it is a sweet self-exclusion period that they don't expect. So they couldn't enter the venue, so they are actually experiencing a period of time that they can feel free from gambling. They can feel relief from it. But for some people, it is definitely one of their coping mechanisms, striking off on their plate. So they may change to other form of stress coping mechanism. And we also observe a booming of online gambling account increase. So a study conducted at the end of 2020, and the conclusions was men aged between 18 to 34 actually have an observable amount of increase betting amount and also account open during 2020, so between the first period of the lockdown. And they also observe the money that they bet with has been increasing from $680 per week to $1,000 and $1,100 per week. So it is very important to note that during this time, those people in that age group, those men in that age group usually have the government support relief program, such as the JobKeeper, Job Seeker program, and we will observe that some amount of that money actually go into gambling during the lockdown. And I think it is very important to notice that with this report, we see there are more young people, especially male, engaged with online gambling. They log in more often. There are more accounts open during that period of time. So the betting amount is also increased during this period of time. And not just from the consumer, and also from the gambling platform, we see significantly increased amounts of gambling ads and funding into different media platforms such as YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, radio, all the channels that we see, you name it, and you can see how gambling advertisement has been booming in all these platforms. And those are the concerns that we see, how our colleagues see. Because with our experience as a service provider, we don't see a huge increase of people seeking help, and that is what concerning, especially with this cohort of people engaging in gambling. This time, men 18 to 24, and we don't see our numbers increase. So for the next slide, we will be able to see a graph of consumer spending trackers. So this is an interesting study that a statistic that we have from last month. So we can see the spending per week on the left column on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we can see the time from last year, from March until this year at the end of October. So you can see the trend of so the top bar, I don't have the name, but the top bar is gambling. The second bar, the light blue, is actually food delivery, and the bottom one is alcohol beverages. So they are average spending for all the bank transfer that is collected, and we can see how gambling behavior has been going up and down during this period of time. And it's important to note that in June and July last year in 2020, people can take out their superannuations earlier, so we may see a boom there. In October, we have the grand final and also the Melbourne Cup. So usually there will be a little bit of increase in there, but we can see a decrease in Christmas. But I want to highlight how this year we have been doing. From July to October, you can see a steady growth in there, especially in the grand final, which is happened in the September, and also the Spring Carnival and Melbourne Cup after. So we can see a steady increase throughout time, and it is truly concerning about how people are anticipating the gambling behavior. So that's all the observations I would share today. And after this, I would like to share a case study, a client I work with from 2019 until today. So for the next slide, you can see the basic information of the case study, Jonathan Joe. So can please go to the next slide? Thank you. So Joe is a client of mine, Australian male, age 34. So he's single, living in share house in the past 2 years. So he's a third child with 5 siblings, 3, 1 elder brother, 1 elder sister, 2 younger brother, and 1 younger sister. So it's important to note that this is not the first time he engaged with a Gamblers Help service. He seek Gamblers Help Southern support in between 2015 and 17, and he has been engaging with our service, Gamblers Eastern at Age, from 2019. So the issues he presents to the sections in the first sections was loneliness, grieving for the loss of his father. His gambling has been concerning, and that have also resulted in some financial difficulties. And he has been experiencing consistent trouble in maintaining meaningful relationships around him. So that is just an overview of Joe, but we will get to see him and understand his case better by understanding his childhood. So the next slide gives an overview of Joe's childhood. So he has been experiencing trouble at school and social expressions. So he had attended counseling support for anger management at a very young age. He always felt disconnected at school with friends. He was able to make some friends, but always get into trouble. So he started working at a stable at a very young age, 30, and he started to develop a really strong relationship with nature and also with horses and animals. He enjoyed so much working with animals. And he decided to drop out early at the age of 16 and has been working in the horse racing industry since. Because of working in the industry, he believed he has some inside knowledge about horses, about how it works. So he has decided to gamble a bit with his colleagues. And that's how his gambling started at a very young age, around 16. And he found his gambling behavior become more problematic at the age of 17. At around that number of period of time, his family started aware of his gambling, and he, besides gambling, he has been drinking and drug taking socially with his peers group. So that is Joe's childhood, and I think that gives us a little bit of overview of how the gambling started, how its benefits, and how it kind of maintained with the peers group and also with his coping mechanism developed from a very young stage. So with the next slide, we will be able to see Joe's family dynamic. So Joe is from a family run a successful family business with 3 store. Sorry, yep, thank you. Run 3 stores in Victoria. So it could be due to his positions in the family, in the middle of the whole family, among his siblings. He always compare himself with other siblings, with the life choices, with the achievement, especially on the support that he will receive from other family members. Joe's youngest brother is struggling with drugs, addictions with drugs and of heroin. And he always see him receive lots of supports and attentions from the family members. And for himself, who struggled with gambling addictions, he can see gambling is a problem for him. And he had received some family support for him, but he don't see it as a really consistent and it's a really big support compared with what he see for his younger brother. So he always expressed the feeling of envy, a little bit of shame of why he's not able to overcome it, but yet will feel envy of the support that he's supposed to have. So he has a really good he used to have a really good relationship with his father, and he still have a really good relationship with his younger sister. But among the whole family, he feel really ashamed about his gambling problem and don't really talk about the gambling problem with his family if he doesn't have to. So for the next slide, we can see some of the critical events happened to Joe recently. So this before engaging with our service, Joe has a successful 6 months of abstinence in gambling. So with the support from the Gamblers app Southern, and also with the app 100-day challenge, the campaign, the foundations really run successfully. He was able to maintain a 6 month completely abstinence. So during the time, he was really comfortable, confident, and he also have the full family support and social support around him. So he suggests that he wants to be more in control with his gambling. He can see his lifestyle is important for him to engage in gambling in a way, but not having a problem with it. So he tried to become more strategic with his betting, have a harmonization approach with gambling. But right after he engaged back into gambling, he failed to maintain that control, and that have really damaged his own self-esteem and confidence around gambling control. And he always see himself a disappointment to his family because of what the support level that he had previously during that period of time. So in 2019 July, his father passed away, and it was a really dark period of time for the client. It was really difficult for him to cope with. He engaged with drugs and alcohol heavily again, and also with gambling again. So it is like a triangle in coping for his grieving. And towards November, eventually he reached out to our service. He wants to make a change happen. So after engaging with our service, he was able to maintain 3 months of abstinence and be able to accomplish some of his saving goals and some of his gambling goals. And he was able to save up for a trip to go to overseas, Thailand, which is what he dreamed for. He wants to go to Thailand for a mindfulness reboot camp. But during the trip, he was a victim of physical assault, unfortunately, and he needs to come back to Australia early to receive a medical treatment. And during that time, he was having really difficult struggling to recover and not able to secure any job. And eventually, he was kicked out and become homeless after during March. And that is a really critical period for the client too, because that is where the pandemic has started, and clients' life become really chaotic around him. So during that time, we are the only service, the support service that he kept on engaged. I've tried to refer him to ALD service, to housing support service, but during the time, the client find it really difficult to maintain contact with these services. When he tried to reach out to the homelessness service, eventually he have landed into one. It's really important to note that during that time, he was told that most of the funding dedicated to domestic violence, to female, and also to child who don't have a place to live, and he was not on the priority list. So after weeks of waiting, he finally have a reply. So he was able to secure a room in a motel. But during that period, information was quite chaotic and limited. He thought if he lived in the room of a motel, he would have a high risk of contacting COVID. So at the end, he decided to stay in his vehicle instead of receiving the support. And eventually, with the job seeker payment, he was able to secure a share house again. During that period of time of the homelessness, there was one time that he re-engaged with the family, tried to reach out for the support for the family, but then because of his drinking problem, his youngest brother placed interventions order against the client, and that's what makes the client find really difficult with his family, and once again with the supports and attentions from the family, and he feels shame about it, but also he feels strong about reconnecting with the family, and until this date, reconnecting to the family is one of his goals, but it's one thing that he hesitates to engage with hugely because of the guilt and the shame that the client has been experiencing since the relapses he has been through. So after the support in May, we were able to provide some financial support during the pandemic, but the client has been disconnecting with our service, and in November, the client has reconnected to have reached out to us again because he happened to have a seizure, during work, and he really lose his life over it. And he believed that was a sign for him to make significant changes in his life. And he decided to engage with us. We refer them to the Gambling Mind, where Laurel just mentions in Paran. And then we were able to give him some directions of assessments and also directions of treatments. And he decided to stay with our service. And until this day, he's still engaging with me and has been working on his goal around gambling around his life. So yes, that is the end of the case presentations. I think it's important to note that right now the treatment has been going pretty well, but there are 4 treatment goals that we have been maintaining. Firstly, you want to stay abstinence with gambling and also stay aware of the triggers to gambling and other problematic behavior. Secondly, he wants to stay a really active lifestyle with healthy eating and connections with nature. During this year, the client has been going out to the rural area and also going out to camping whenever he can to try to engage that side of himself with the nature. And the third is he wants to have a stable saving and want to maintain his self-confidence by maintaining a healthy lifestyle and choices. And at the end, he wants to look for work opportunities related to health food and working in nature. And those are the goals that we have been working on and still working on. And that's the case I would like to present today. So here are the questions that I hope can be some interesting discussions within the groups.
Thank you very much, Kevin. So the groups will all have different questions. We've got 2 questions for each group. And when we come back, we'll hear from the groups about the discussion. I think we'll give this one 15 minutes because we've gone a little bit over time. So just to make sure we've got plenty of time for Q&A for this session. But thank you very much, Laurel and Kevin. That was an excellent presentation and we've all learnt a lot. So let's now go to, somebody's controlling my screen. We better stop doing that, Kev. Thanks. Let's go now to those breakout rooms. Thanks, Tom. So once again, just accept the invitation into your breakout rooms and the facilitator will have the case discussion ready for you in there. And Laurel and Kevin, you're welcome to go into a breakout room if you wish. Just ask Tom if you want to go in and...
Yeah, I'm happy to go in one. Kind of observe.
Is that possible, Tom? Can you zoom in?
Yeah, sure. Kevin, do you want to go in one?
So I'm in 5, Tom, so you don't need to add anyone to that one because it gets heavy with leaders.
Kevin, do you want to stay here or do you want to go into a room?
So Laurel and Kevin, Aussie Kevin, do you want to start the discussion?
Should I get the feedback from the breakout room first, and then I will answer some of the feedback, and then maybe I will facilitate some of the discussions afterwards?
Sounds good. Okay. So if we could have Alf first to answer question 1. Just unmute there, Alf.
My apologies.
That's all right.
So maybe that it's strongly linked to the fundamental thing of overcoming financial difficulties, believing that, you know, just being able to have that big win will end all of the shame and the guilt and the debt. That was a one that came up. Mm-hmm. And as a coping mechanism for the emotional regulation that we're presenting in early childhood, the anger, and relating that to, finding it as a way of mitigating those emotional regulation challenges. That's what I have for question 1.
Fantastic, thank you. Stephen, do you want to just answer question 2 for us?
Oh, I'm on mute. There we go. Yeah, so we had so the second question: how might the client master their gambling in a social context? Well, this was interesting because at first we were I think fairly slow in coming up with some of the answers, but then what we realized is it's increasingly pervasive in a lot of different contexts. There's a lot of exposure to it. I mean, you know, his work situation involves working for a place associated with gambling, but also, you know, during the pandemic, all the support services that he might be able to divert from wouldn't be available to him, and it would be more and more difficult for him to seek out any access. At the same time, all the problematic things he's exposed to are heightened. So yeah, it would be difficult for him to, you know, in terms of masking it. Someone mentioned that he'd be, you know, probably talking more about the successes and not talking about the, you know, the losses he's had through gambling. But yeah, just how easily accessible it is. You know, we think of it traditionally as being through, you know, pubs and horse races, but there's so much of it that's just available through phone apps and a lot of the social media advertising now that's targeted. So yeah, it's just difficult for him to get away from that.
Terrific. Thanks, Stephen. Now we're going to ask, who did question 3? Anna.
Yeah, I think we had 3 and 4, but
just 3.
Yep, no worries. So again, if gambling wasn't identified as an issue, it would be quite difficult because we're not sure, you know, why does he have the financial difficulties? Why is he experiencing this conflict? So it wouldn't give you a very holistic picture there. It might impact on the engagement, the rapport and the engagement and the trust that you build with the person. Especially when you've got the feelings of shame involved there. And it would limit your assessment and also a possible case plan that you might, in terms of how might you work with this person and the next step, and also might have an impact on the capacity for change for them, because you might be trying to work on some of those other issues and not really address the key issue for this particular person. And that might feed into the cycle and exacerbate those feelings of feeling inadequate. Yeah, so there's some of the key things.
Fantastic. Thanks, Anna. That was very comprehensive. Susie, do you want to answer question 4?
Yeah, sure. We just first off, we were saying that one of the barriers would be that often, I know in my service especially, and it's made me actually think about it, we don't specifically ask a new client about any gambling behaviour, so it could be quite easily missed as well. And once it is identified, we were discussing, so some of the adjustments made would be, once it's identified, you could hopefully start to make the links between how one of the behaviours might interact with another, like, you know, if they're drinking, for instance, with a group of friends, it might lower their inhibitions and it might then make them gamble more and so forth. So once it is identified, you could start to see what that bigger picture is with the client and how one of those behaviours interacts with another.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks, Susie. Kevin, do you want to interact now into that?
Sure. Great discussions. I think all the groups had. I have been in one of the group, particularly in group 2, and there are a few things I would like to answer. Firstly, for the functions of gambling, I think the idea of the big win is an essential one, because for a lot of problematic gambling behavior, they all believe in that big win so that they can stop gambling. But when that eventually happens, they will want to chase back the losses that they had in the past. So it would manifest more gambling from that too, and give them the sense of hope, the sense of control. Eventually, it will happen again, but with how gambling design, all the odds calculated behind, we know it is very unlikely. And even if it happened again, it's very difficult for the client to be able to, withdraw themselves from gambling and have abstinence from it after they have that sense of hope experienced from gambling. So the big win, the vicious cycle of whether gambling starts or whether mental health starts is a quite an interesting issues as well. Whether the person is in a really bad place in mental health, and then gambling become one of the coping mechanism, or whether gambling was first started as a social activities, but then because of the thrill, because of the urges, it manifests into more problems in financially, relationships, maybe with other coping strategies, and then lead to a really bad place, mental health. Which first, egg first or chicken first? That is always an intriguing discussion with the clients when I see them. So for the second questions, masking in different social contexts, the particularly emotions and condition we want to get into is actually shame and guilt. So I think in my discuss group we mentioned about how gambling advertised as a casual social event interactions in Victoria, in Australia. Throughout the whole pandemic, we see all the gambling ads saying bet with mates, it's really casual, it's just easy fun. Even with MasterChef, even with Love Island, all these different shows, they have gambling pool with it. So it's fun to engage with. Even for company, at each we don't have those, but I heard stories from other service provider that could be polling about a match of about the outcome of the Melbourne Cup or outcome of the footy. Those are some subtle gambling stigma that we see in our society, but we don't really address it sometimes. So if a person is struggling with gambling and seeing their peers are okay with gambling, are staying in control with gambling, how would that feel? How would the shame and guilt build up in their own sense? So that is the message behind the masking, the concern we see when people mask longer than it is among the peers. So that is the second one. The third one, because I don't see the questions right now, let me go back to the slides. Okay, if problematic gambling was not identified, I think the group has a really good touch on that one too. It will be missed out on the case planning, on the referral pathway, and also on the changes possible for the client. I think questions 3 and 4 is really good to look together in the sense of how the shame and also how we can help the client to achieve their best outcome. Because if gambling is not identified, I think from Alfred Hospital to Gambling Mind, the social worker Vicky North once discussed with us that domestic violence questions in all the assessment wasn't the compulsory questions a few years back. And it's a question that some of us, some of the service providers, some of the professionals will ask our clients directly because of our work experience and concern, because we notice how this may manifest other problem. But gambling in Victoria is so normalized right now. Basically, I think everyone in their lifetime may have gambled once now and then, but they don't know to what extent is it become a problem, to what extent it will become a problem to other things in life, and whether these questions should be included in some of the assessment, the general sessions for service provider. And I think the question 3 and 4 really highlight that because of the barrier, because of how limitations we may see in our work with clients if it is not identified. And with these questions, I want to once again highlight how after the pandemic, how devastated we have been seeing the community have been. We noticed from all the research, we noticed from all the statistics, enormously from the bank, consumer behavior. Gambling has been one of the top not among Victoria, but we don't see it reflect on our numbers in reaching out, in referrals, in all the other support that we can provide. And that's what concerning us. And Narelle, is there anything you want to add here?
I think most of it's covered. In the group that I was in for the breakout room, I know in terms of functions, we kind of looked at themes around the client's sense of self
Mm.
and identity, given that obviously they've worked in the stables and kind of in that horsing world for such a long period of time. Obviously, you work more intimately with the client, so I don't know too much around how that's how relevant that is.
Yeah, I'm aware of time, but I can touch a little bit on that. That is one of the protective factors around the clients, that the client enjoy engaging with enjoy engaging with animals, horse specifically, but the client doubt his ability to re-engage with horses in the future because of the fear of gambling. So therefore, the client have made choices right now. He's actually right now working in the farm within the area, so that he can engage with that nature. He don't have to be triggers with all the TV ads or gambling ads that he was exposed to. He don't have to engage with that conversations with his colleagues in the building industry in the past, or in the horsing industry in the past. And he really enjoys that, and he really wants to keep his lifestyle in that way too. So it's one of the protective factors that we try to analyze, understand what is the core value that the client have, and how to engage with that core value. It has been quite helpful for the client to realize that and to work with his gambling triggers at the same time.
Fantastic, Kevin. Thank you so much for that really thorough case study. I'm sure we've all learnt a lot from that. Can we just ask you a couple of quick questions before we finish up
Sure.
today?
Of course.
And either of you are welcome to answer. So the first one is, and if anyone has questions to add, please do that now. And you can also like the questions, which prioritises them for me. How should we screen for gambling problems in our work? What's the best screen that you would use?
Yeah, I'm happy to chip in for this one, and Kevin, you can add if you'd like to. There's the Southern Oaks gambling screen. It has, South Oaks gambling screen. There's a number of questions, but there's also a condensed version. That's 3 questions, I believe. The questions are around: have you ever gambled? Have you ever gambled and lost more than you intended? So have you spent more money than you intended to? Has anyone criticised or questioned your gambling before? Have you felt guilt or shame related to your gambling? So
Fantastic,
yeah, just a short screening tool that covers different aspects.
Is there a link that folks can go to find this screening tool, Arel?
I'm happy to. I'm happy to send it through.
That'd be great. If you've got it now, just put it in the chat. Otherwise, just send it through in an email.
Cool.
That'd be great. Okay, and the next question, would it be helpful to alter the narrative on gambling away from pokies to impulsive spending that is impacting someone's ability to live life to their values? Tricky one.
I think with pokies, it's interesting to mention this is actually the first year we see the spending of pokies has been suppressed by the spending of online betting. We always suspect that will happen. Online betting even eventually will catch up and become the top spending in gambling, but it always has been pokies in the past few years. And with the help of the pandemic, it finally happened. So we noticed in the last few weeks, there has been record people going back to the RSL club and the pokie spending there. But I think focus on the questions on the narrative. It's really important to know what is the reason why the client go to those spendings. Because for some people, it is for the social values of it. For some people, it is for the routine purpose of it, like social and also the routine that they have. So if we alternate a narrative, we also alternating that behavior. Maybe we need to suggest what sort of other behavior they can do if they want to engage in the same social sense, or what to replace in that routine in order to achieve the similar goal. So simply just alternate the narrative, I don't think help super a lot. But by understanding the triggers, the reason, the motivations for the client to go to those venues can help to understand and change.
I just wanted to add quickly, I like the idea, I guess, if the narrative is shifted around values. I think there's, around value-driven decisions. So if I spend 50% of my income on the pokies, how does that distance me from my values as a person or in my community or what I'm wanting in life? So yeah, I like it from that aspect, maybe.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's it could be interpreted in a few ways, but I think you've done a great job answering it. Thank you. Just for the sake of time, we're just going to quickly go to the last question. How is in-game gambling a concerning illegal activity? It was in the news today, in-game gambling.
That is a really difficult one to answer, to be honest.
Sorry, firstly, can someone explain what that is?
Okay, so there can be two interpretations. The first one that comes to mind will be when a sports match happening, people can place multi-bet or place in-game bet while the race happen. So if you need to understand the differences, you need to understand what was the way it used to be with gambling. So back in 20 years ago, I think you only buy a bet on first goal, bet on the result of the match, maybe the result of the half match. That is how it is. It used to be. But now it's more interactive. They can make in-game decisions. They can withdraw the bet in the middle of the game, and they can be refunded with gambling credits with many of the service provider. So they can make more instant decisions. They can feel more in control with all these decisions. And from study, we know 90% of people, mostly 90% of people, will actually bet again with their betting credit that they can get from the in-game, the decisions that they make. So, as someone who works in this industry, we notice those are all marketing strategies to keep people engaged, to keep people anticipate into the game, to keep thinking about the game. But for people who enjoy the match, of course, they feel more in control. They feel they can make more instant decisions, and it is not, 100% losing or 100% winning when the game is not done. So basically, that's what it means.
So it's concerning in the sense that they may spend a lot more money in that kind of gambling mode.
I would not say not a lot of money, because some people, they will, divide the money. They may spend less money, but they may spend more time and more effort into thinking about gambling, into anticipating the gambling. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you so much for answering all of those questions today.
I guess that's just explaining but not answering, but it's a tough one.
Yeah, good explanation, yeah. Thank you so much, Kevin and Laurel, for your presentation. It was really very engaging and very interesting, and I'm sure we're all going to think more about gambling in our broader work. We're going to go to a quick break now, folks, so I'd like you back by 11:10, and we'll be coming back for another really stimulating discussion about family violence and mental health with the family violence team. So we hope to see you back in 10. Thanks, folks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're just going to do recording now. Okay, so I just want to introduce you to our specialist family violence team at Eastern Health Mental Health Program. Pauline is the Senior Specialist Family Violence Advisor for the Eastern Health Mental Health Program, and she's a mental health social worker with over 20 years experience in community mental health, dual diagnosis, and clinical liaison psychiatry. She's accompanied today by her team members, Rosie Garvey and Kate Stewart. So I'm going to hand over now to Pauline, and Pauline, you should have a remote control of this slideshow now. If you don't, let me know.
Nothing's moving. Sorry, Bron, nothing's happening.
Yeah, I've given you the remote. So sometimes it's because I've had to press a button on my screen and then you just have to double click on your screen to get the remote.
So, okay, here we go. So I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to my elders past, present and emerging. And I extend the respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples here today. I'd also like to acknowledge all people across the continuum of age who have experienced family violence and recognise that women have the highest risk of lethality from family violence. It is for these people that we are here today to learn and to grow as health professionals and other carers so that we can support and respond appropriately. We do acknowledge the lived experience in the room of those who have loved, known, or are someone who has been affected by family violence. And if needed, we do encourage you to access family violence supports by liaising with your manager or specialist services in the community. So just briefly, while we talk about the prevalence of family violence, I do want to talk about some safety in the space today. If we are talking about cases, please consider confidentiality and how those cases may impact on others in the room. Consider whether appropriate to use real life examples. And as we've already said, we'll take questions at the end of the presentation. So firstly, what is family violence? So family violence is the leading contributor to preventable death and disability and illness in Victorian women aged 15 to 44 years. Under the Family Violence Protection Act, it is a behaviour by a person towards a family member that is physically or sexually abusive, is emotionally or psychologically abusive, economically abusive, threatening, coercive or dominated, and it causes fear. The definition includes people across the lifespan, children, adolescents, adults and elders. And the definition also includes behaviours that cause a child to witness or hear or otherwise be exposed to the effects of family violence. Sorry, how do I go back? So, just taking into account the GIAC definition of family violence, for our Indigenous Family Violence Task Force in 2003. And so they define family violence as an issue focused around a wide range of physical, emotional, sexual, social, spiritual, cultural, psychological and economic abuses that occur within families, intimate relationships, extended families, kinship networks and communities. It extends to one-on-one fighting, abuse of Indigenous community workers, as well as self-harm, injury and suicide. So you can see that the definition is much wider than the legal definition. So when we were putting this together, and I had a discussion with Bronwyn, we decided to break it down into the three main areas of family that are affected by family violence. And to be honest, we could talk about each of these for hours, but we are limiting ourselves to 10 minutes. So we are just going to give a brief description of the impact and the intersection of family violence for children. Then Rosie will speak about adults who are victim survivors, and then Kate will speak about adults who are using violence. So when we think about a child is a victim of family violence if they see, hear or are exposed to family violence. Statistics show us that 1 in 4 children experience family violence. It is also closely correlated to physical and child sexual abuse of children. And it has also been a factor in 80% of child deaths known to Child Protection in 2013. We also know that of the women who experience family violence, 50% have children in their care. And we need to remember that children do not have to see violence to be affected by it. A child can be exposed to violence either by directly experiencing the violence or witnessing violence being inflicted upon somebody else. We need to consider the impact of violence on children. We need to consider the emotional and psychological impacts and how the controlling and violent behaviour can often further impact that child into adulthood. We also need to consider how the person using violence uses intimidation and emotional manipulation, and how this impacts on the child. So you'll see in the wheel, if you can briefly see it, but some of the things that it talks about is also how the person using violence uses the child and uses their child emotionally against the victim survivor. So when we consider the impact on children, we use and the language of and the experience of adverse childhood experiences. So these are stressful incidents or environments where children experience and which have potential to cause long-lasting trauma. Psychological trauma is what happens when a person is overwhelmed by stress. When this occurs, it can cause lasting harm to the brain stress responses, potentially leaving those affected by trauma feeling like they are fighting old dangers years after they've passed. So ACE studies on impact on child development, and the research has found exposure to family violence is associated with a range of outcomes, including diminished educational attainment, reduced social participation in early adulthood, physical and psychological disorders, and suicidal ideation. Adverse childhood experiences encompass various forms of physical and emotional abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, and this is experienced in childhood. ACEs have been linked to premature death as well as to various health conditions, including those of mental health disorders. ACEs are linked to chronic health problems, mental illness, and substance misuse in adulthood. What we need to consider is the impact of adverse childhood experiences on the child, but taking those experiences into their adulthood. So the Royal Commission into Family Violence found that all services have an opportunity to identify family violence earlier to prevent early trauma experiences and to improve adult health. So family violence trauma can disrupt child development and healthy attachments and compromise brain development. Children do not need to understand or have language to feel the impact of violence. And this point is very, when we think about pregnancy and when a child's in utero, they are impacted by the experiences of the mother's trauma. People might use the language, well, the child, is in the cot, so they're not experiencing, or they're asleep, they're not experiencing it as a baby. But we know that the trauma impact on the brain is occurring. Family violence has enduring detrimental impacts and significantly increases the risk of mental health disorders at all stages of life. So the manifestations of trauma include regression, such as bedwetting, sleep disturbances, withdrawing, being anxious or being aggressive. Some children develop chronic somatic problems. Other children and young people might engage with risk-taking behaviours such as using drugs or alcohol, or experience suicidal ideation or other mental health difficulties. We think about some of the other impacts: diminished educational attainment, reduced social participation in early adulthood, physical and psychological disorders, behavioural difficulties, homelessness, future victimisation or violence offending, feeling guilt or blame themselves for the violence, having trouble forming positive relationships, developing phobias and insomnia, struggles at school, using bullying behaviours or being bullied, difficulty concentrating, and having less empathy and caring for others. What the research is also showing us, that children are victim survivors of family violence, and they also have strengths and resilience and build other ways of managing in a positive way as well. Often research focuses on the more adverse effects. This is a very busy slide and I won't go into it because most of it we've just talked about, but what it does is talk about the impact of family violence across the lifespan. And just pointing out again that unborn child, that baby and toddler, they are still the victims of family violence, even though they can't express that they know what's occurring in their home. And we start to see attachment disorganisation and whether this is early signs of a potential attachment disorders into adulthood. So where to from here? So Neil, the research and all the therapeutic responses talk about children needing to have a childhood, a secure and warm relationship with a parent or other primary caregiver, and that both children and parents can recover and heal from the impacts of violence. So we're really looking at that recovery process through healing of relationship within families. And I think that, the reason I do a lot of this work is this early intervention. So this idea that we're screening for family violence, we're looking for family violence earlier, so that we can assist families and assist children and intervene for children, leads to improved outcomes for those children. So Australian Childhood Foundation recommends the safe and secure training, as it is really important for children to process and make meaning of their experiences to allow for healing to occur. Specialist services are available to further unpack therapeutic services that can work with children in their recovery. And research and current thinking into therapeutic responses to children exposed to family violence should include working with the mother or to the non-offending parent and children to strengthen attachment, and it needs to be trauma informed. And the research is starting to look at around how the impact of the loss of the relationship with the offending parent, and how that needs to potentially be incorporated in therapeutic responses, which is a real shift to how we've been thinking about the impact of children. I'm going to pass you over to Rosie.
Hello, thank you, Pauline. So just moving on to the next slide. Do you want me to take control or do you want to keep going, Bronwyn? There we go. Yeah. All right. So I just wanted to start off with a quote from a consumer's mother who had her first experience of a really empathetic response to her safety. This was an example of the impact of not only being a carer of a person with mental illness who also uses violence, but also the impact on that person's mental health as a result of what she experienced. So she said, "Thank you for asking me about my safety. No one has ever asked before. As a mother of a son who has schizophrenia and uses drugs, I've just always put up with the aggression and violence." So she was supported to have her risk assessed and to do a safety plan for the first time. And that was an empowering process for her, where she was able to gain a sense of agency. So unfortunately, it's a really common narrative that we hear too frequently, where a parent has been really burnt out by their child's use of violence against them. They maybe haven't felt able to speak up about this due to a range of barriers that they might have been feeling at that time, such as fear, shame, embarrassment, even guilt. Sometimes the expectation just to care for their child no matter what, even when they're an adult, especially if they're a carer, feeling that they basically need to prioritise that relationship over their own support needs and immediate safety. So being validated and supported in ways to stay safe really, again, increases that sense of having control and then being able to reflect on what they've been doing that whole time to keep themselves safe and building on that. So in clinical practice, dealing with these forms of violence can be very challenging, particularly when family members are involved in the person's care, but at the same time when they require their own protection. So balancing the inclusion of family members is good practice, but when we're talking about domestic violence, it's really important to be having a careful consideration of all of the family members and their safety. The safety of victim survivors is the first priority, with ensuring consent that is sought and that the wishes of those people are always adhered to in that process. Just trying to move on to the next slide.
tap on the actual flight.
Sorry, I was trying to use the keys, but it wasn't working. With adult victim survivors, the main mental health impacts that we know statistically are depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and suicide ideation. Family violence, past or present, including childhood sexual abuse, can cause or exacerbate poor mental health and mental illness. There's a large body of evidence that shows the relationship between family violence and poorer mental health outcomes. So the World Health Organization actually identified these as the most prevalent, with also a 2016 Australian study finding that women who experienced gender-based violence in particular were likely to experience mental illness over the course of their lifetime, with up to 77% of women experiencing anxiety disorders, around 56% experiencing post-traumatic stress, and 35% had made suicide attempts at that time. That was an Anne Rose study. There was a further study that also found that half of female suicides that had been studied at that time, there was interpersonal violence present, and up to a third in the male instances. So those effects are obviously at their peak during and after crisis, but can last for a very long time. But it's been shown that the longer that someone does feel safe, that depression can potentially start to decline and they can start to recover. So the intersection between mental health and family violence it also talks to a whole range of other diagnoses, such as bipolar, psychosis, schizophrenia, and eating disorders. So family violence overall is the greatest health risk factor for women aged 18 to 44. So that causes not just injury and disability and, of course, death, which are our main concerns when we're dealing with risk assessment, but it's also considering the short and the long-term effects of mental illness and also chronic health problems that come from that. So other significant mental health issues would include increasing substance use to be able to cope with family violence. And there's a well-established link as well with postnatal depression. Many people who experience family violence, especially since childhood, also have an experience of hearing voices, and that can include hearing the perpetrator. Sometimes that's defending themselves in that memory and internalizing the shame as well. So I can think myself of when I was working in community mental health and I did an audit of my own case files, and I found that 90% of my consumers had experienced either childhood or earlier in their life experienced family violence, and some of them were experiencing it currently. And I found that really that was a huge factor in the determinants of how their life then went later on. You know, it really had a great link towards some of the mental health issues that they were experiencing. I think that essentially if we're able to address family violence earlier and more comprehensively, we're able to really reduce the impact of mental illness. And in some cases, we can prevent that. So that was just my own example, but it's actually well backed up by studies in public mental health that have reached anywhere between 30 to 90% of public health consumers in psychiatric services experiencing interpersonal violence, and that's especially when you're considering childhood abuse. So also just to consider further intersection in this area, thinking about how a person using violence would also use mental illness against the affected person. So for example, where a perpetrator will perceive mental illness as a vulnerability to target, attempting to deliberately undermine that person's sanity. So for example, using gaslighting, causing them not to see the coercive control as family violence, but as something that they did wrong. So this is also preventing them from accessing treatment or support using that sort of coercion, and controlling the narrative when they're presented to services, possibly even doing the talking for them or as a carer presenting a different narrative of them being crazy and unreliable. That can also be used then to discredit them in family and children's court or to police. For example, again, sort of presenting her as chaotic and hysterical due to the distress, whereas the person who's using violence presents as calm and considered and actually quite manipulative. Most commonly, using mental illness in this way, they're sort of making it feel like no one will believe them, especially when there's a psychotic illness. And most of the time this works. This impacts a victim survivor to the point where they expect that this narrative is true and they've heard it for too long, so they don't come forward easily. So complex trauma occurs as a result of repeated trauma experienced by a child or young person, but can also experience that as an adult. So it's important to remember that family violence is actually complex trauma. It's repeated, it's overwhelming stress, it's a pattern of incidents, and it causes cumulative harm. So trauma is a state of high arousal in events or circumstances where that person feels threatened or is threatened. So that, overwhelms that person's ability to cope, their capacity. So the ways that a person learns to cope may then impact on the sort of mental illness that can then develop over time. So for example, personality disorders. Trauma can affect many areas of a person's life. So in particular, if it happened in childhood, particularly if they didn't receive appropriate care or support at the time, or if violence occurred at a pre-verbal age. So again, talking about complex trauma, we know that the impacts can last a long time. For example, people might experience triggers and flashbacks long after the event. For example, disassociation because of trauma. An example I can recall is a person who would have a very strong reaction to a certain cologne or a certain smell that they associated with somebody from their past. Also, this feeling of being ashamed, stigma, experiencing discrimination, which we know are huge barriers to people accessing support, and that places them at further risk of being isolated, which is already what is usually happening in the relationship, where the person who's using violence may be controlling where they go, who they see, what they do. So overall, it's not feeling able to trust others, services, maybe family. They might have spoken to the family about them, essentially inviting them to collude with the perpetrator. So of course, this affects self-esteem and the belief that they deserve family violence support. They might not feel entitled to access funding, for example. I remember many times applying for flexible support packages of funding, and clients would just be like, no, you give it to someone who really needs it, someone who deserves it. And it's like, no, you deserve it too. But they've had this feeling that they don't deserve any of these things. They might not feel entitled to access that. Or conversely, they might be quite reliant on other people and have built up some of that over time. There's also difficulty managing feelings, for example, self-soothing, and that need for validation, for example, in their relationships. Yep, so I'll wrap it up. I just wanted to also speak to those coping strategies that can also be things like, of course, self-harm and overeating and even perfectionism, and also chronic health conditions, as well as mental health, such as fibromyalgia, IBS, and chronic pain. So that's, your body having been on high alert for danger for such a long time that the amygdala response connects to the central nervous system and the gut health. And that, of course, then impacts on feeling depressed and anxious and then cancelling appointments. And that person might not really fit then the policy of 2 cancellations and then you need to close the case. So this is where we really need to consider not just being trauma aware, but trauma responsive. It's really necessary to sensitively engage with people who have these multiple presenting needs. So by creating a safe environment, so that's in the room where you are, and in considering your next steps. So recognizing the impact of their experience, firstly with belief, a sensitive care, remembering that they might need some more time in order to be able to fully disclose that. So just considering your timing and their readiness and dependent on their needs at that moment. Just building trust slowly, showing you care, handling that response by showing them that you can do this, whether that's reaching out for secondary consult or then speaking to a family violence service. It doesn't mean that you have to do it alone. So we really want to encourage that you're able to share that risk with others, and that in turn helps you to feel actively supported, as do they, and they don't feel like they have to repeat everything. Thank you. I'll now pass across to Kate.
Awesome. Thanks for that. I'm not sure if I have the powers to click through the slides. Doesn't seem to be working. That's all right. Pauline or Rosie, are you able just to click through? Yeah, awesome. Thank you. So thanks for that, Rosie. That was really informative. So I'm here to speak today to people who use violence and the intersection with mental health, as well as other factors such as substance use. So there's a common societal myth that people with mental illness are more likely to perpetrate violence. But what findings actually show is that mental illness carries far less weight as a predictor of violence than other factors such as history of violent victimization, history of offending, and involvement with substance use. However, systematic reviews of research have concluded that most, if not all, of the increased risk is associated with co-occurring substance use rather than mental illness alone. Without substance use, a person with mental illness is only as likely as anybody else in society to be violent. What the facts actually show is that people with a mental illness are more likely to be a victim of violence than to perpetrate violence. Women and men with all types of mental illness diagnoses, such as depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, report higher rates of family violence experiences toward them as victim survivors, rather than individuals without mental illness. Also there, just to note that people who use violence is the preferred language by Aboriginal people and their communities. This is recognising that the term perpetrator can sometimes create barriers to engagement with Aboriginal people who use violence. Just next slide, if that's okay. Thank you. So what we know about people who use violence. So the drivers of family violence include deeply held beliefs about masculinity and gender inequality. Some examples of this include condoning of violence against women, violence supporting attitudes, men's control of decision-making, which limits women's independence, rigid ideas of gender roles and identities, and male-peer relationships that emphasize or support disrespect or aggression towards women. Perpetrators tend to blame other people, alcohol, mental illness, or other circumstances for violent outbursts. But if we think about it, there are plenty of people in society who use substances, drink, or have a mental illness that don't perpetrate violence. Perpetrators often minimize, blame others, justify, or deny their use of violence or the impact of their violence for these same reasons. Therefore, it's important to remember that factors such as substance use and mental health can be a contributing factor, but are not the sole cause of family violence alone. Mental illness and depression is listed as a risk factor on the Barham Risk Assessment. This is as mortality rates in family violence have been associated with perpetrators who have mental illness, particularly depression. Mental illness may be linked with an escalation, frequency, and severity of violence, but again, is not the sole cause of violence. Just the next slide, please. So, however, it is important to know if a perpetrator is showing signs and symptoms of a significant mental illness, such as delusions or psychosis. As aforementioned, mental illness may be linked with change in escalation and severity of violence, particularly when occurring with drug and alcohol misuse by the perpetrator. Some ways in which mental illness and personality disorders and factors of these conditions may be linked with escalation, frequency, and severity of violence includes, but is not limited to, morbid jealousy, suicidality, and substance-induced psychosis. We could talk about this for a while, but I think these are sort of three key themes that we see in our work. So in terms of morbid jealousy, It can occur in a number of conditions such as chronic alcoholism, substance addiction, organic brain disorders such as Parkinson's, Huntington's disease, schizophrenia, neuroses, or personality disorders. So morbid jealousy is a range of irrational thoughts and emotions coupled with extreme behavior in which often the dominant theme is preoccupation with a partner's infidelity based on unfounded evidence. In morbid jealousies, the risk of violence occurring are significantly increased. This is as a perpetrator's obsessive or excessive behavior when experiencing jealousy is often related to controlling behaviors, which are founded in the belief of ownership of the victim and has been linked to violent attacks. As such, obsession and or jealousy toward the victim is a high risk factor on the Marum risk assessment. In terms of suicidality, oops, sorry, can you go back? In terms of suicidality, threats or attempts to self-harm or commit suicide are also listed as a high risk factor for mortality in family violence. This is as suicide as a risk factor is an extreme extension of controlling behavior. It is important to understand how often and how recent threats or attempts to suicide or self-harm are occurring to provide guidance on the immediacy of risk. An example of this in the context of family violence is if a man uses the threat of suicide to coerce or control a woman to stay in the relationship if she expressed a desire to leave. So as aforementioned, it's also important to know if the perpetrator is currently showing signs of significant mental illness, such as psychosis or delusions, which can often occur in the context of substance-induced psychosis. Specific drugs such as ice may actively contribute to distorted thinking and violence for some people using these drugs and may also manifest as psychotic or delusional symptoms. Perpetrators with substance-induced issues can have impaired social functioning or reduced capacity for self-regulation. This can lead to an escalation of violence and therefore creates an increase in the level of risk. This includes drug-induced psychosis, which are false beliefs that are firmly held despite clear evidence to the contrary and can sometimes include hallucinations triggered or exacerbated by use of substances such as ice. An example of this could be a man who is using ice, experiences an episode of drug-induced psychosis, and holds a false belief that his partner is cheating on him. As such, he monitors his partner's phone, her conversations, or her whereabouts due to this belief, all of which is a form of family violence. In saying all of this, it is vital to recognise the perpetrator's choice to use substances or alcohol, despite their knowledge of how alcohol and drugs can change their behaviour when using these substances. This is as to recognise substance use and the subsequent behaviour as a choice of the perpetrator. Importantly, remember that many people who have a mental illness or use alcohol and substances are not violent. Next slide, please. So where to from here? The key message that I had today is that family violence is a fundamental violation of human rights and is unacceptable in any form. Primary prevention action starts with addressing the gendered drivers of violence against women and other forms of discrimination. Some ways that we can do this are listening to and supporting survivors, teaching consent, starting and engaging in conversations about equality, standing against sexual violence, holding yourself and others accountable, and involvement in campaigns such as the 16 Days of Activism, which is coming up in about a week's time. Mental health and other community services have a responsibility under the Marum framework to address family violence. Clinicians and workers are expected to become skilled in recognising and understanding and inquiring about and responding to family violence. They're not expected to be family violence specialists. Mental health, accommodation, AOD, family services and other community services can identify and respond to family violence by supporting those experiencing family violence, facilitating safety and protection, including of children, and holding those who perpetrate violence accountable for their actions. It can be a challenging space to work with individuals who use violence, but every time a person who uses violence interacts with the service system, this is an opportunity for us as professionals to affect behaviour change and intervene to create changes and stop or reduce family violence at the source. And I think back to you, Pauline.
So thank you. We're going to go into breakout rooms and again, we've divided these up between child victim survivor, adult victim survivor, and person using violence. And Rosie, Kate and I will come into those groups as well. So just quickly, we'll go through each case example and then there'll be questions that will be posed in the breakout rooms. So Xavier is a 6-year-old child referred to the KIMS program, which is your child, youth and mental health service program via his school and child protection. He's referred due to concerns re learning difficulties and sexualised behaviour at school. Xavier is showing signs of aggression towards his mother and calls her names. Xavier is an only child. There's an exclusion IVO has been taken out to protect Xavier after and his mother after an incident where the father physically assaulted the mother. Xavier had to run to the neighbours who called police. Just go to the next slide, Rosie. So Kylie is a 45-year-old mother of 3 admitted to the mental health inpatient unit. Her son found her unconscious in the family home after taking an overdose of medication. She has no previous mental health presentations, but reports she has been prescribed sleeping and anxiety tablets by her GP due to anxiety and difficulties in her marriage. She has ongoing suicidal thoughts. Kylie reports she has increased her alcohol use to cope with her husband's controlling behaviour. She tells the nurse she wants to leave the relationship, but worries for her teenage children. And finally, an adult person using violence, and this is an often scenario that we see in mental health. Craig is a 33-year-old man with a lived experience of schizoaffective disorder. He was diagnosed in his early 20s and has had 3 admissions to a mental health inpatient unit. He's currently on a community treatment order and being managed with a depot medication-based local community mental health team. Craig is using marijuana and ice and has become increasingly disengaged from his case manager. He lives with his parents who are struggling to maintain boundaries as he is becoming increasingly aggressive and demanding, standing over his parents for money, and on the weekend he punched his mother in the face. Parents did not call police as they don't want Craig to go to jail, but reported the incident to the mental health case manager. So Bronwyn, we're happy to go into breakout rooms.
Yes, absolutely. This is time now. Tom will put us in the breakout rooms. Pauline, Rosie and Kate will also go into breakout rooms. I think I've sent Tom some details on that. And we'll be back in 15 minutes. Thanks, guys. I'll go into number 5.
Mention which.
Oops, I better stop the recording. That's it. Okay, welcome back, folks. I'll hand it back to Pauline and team. And Pauline, if you'd like, I can just name the people that are going to share briefly from the rooms.
That would be great. Thank you.
No worries. All right, so our first report back will be Lisa for the child victim survivor.
Yeah, we had Xavier. We talked about having how do we get Xavier's voice heard when he's so young and he's not the direct client, and we were talking about ways that we could do that. That included perhaps talking to his mum about her experiences, but also her perspective on Xavier's experiences, and really getting her to focus on telling his story and seeing his perspective as a way to stay connected to his issues. And then we also had a very large discussion around trauma and recognising trauma in young children, and not, like was mentioned before in the main presentation, but I'm not assuming because he wasn't there or didn't seem to see it that he wasn't greatly affected by it. So making sure that, dealing with trauma as a reason for the other behaviours rather than the other way around.
Thanks, Lisa. Anna, did you want to add anything to that?
No, because we did discuss that. Very similar about having, you know, the active safety plans with the child, and you know, I guess sort of saying, look, the child is part of that family unit, so having has been impacted by the family violence.
And Susie? Is Susie there?
Sorry, I'm on mute. Sorry, I've been talking.
Thanks.
Similar to what Lisa and Anna said, I think the word curious kept coming up. So asking a lot of curious questions around the child's behaviours, and being quite specific about, you know, asking if there's, you know, what their behaviours like, being like at school and from other services involved as well.
Terrific. Thanks, Susie. For the adults, Faye. Faye might be muted as well.
For Kylie, we discussed talking about creating a safe space for her, giving her time, finding out what it is she would like. It doesn't appear that she's really spoken about her situation very much in the past. She has had some dialogue with her GP, but we don't know how much. We talked about some education around trauma, AOD use, family violence, what's available to her. And we wanted to find out too what she wanted. You know, what does she want? How does she want to move forward? And there could be concern around the safety of her children as well, even though they're older children, she's concerned about their safety. So if she declines, all we can do is, well, we can look at motivational interviewing, trying to move her forward in her thoughts, but it is her choice. But I think it's important to supply her with information that if at a later date she chooses to seek help, she knows where she can find it. And we just looked about some referral options for her to family service, AOD counselling, support for her children. Yeah, so.
Perfect, thanks, Faye. Just really quickly, Alf, did you want to add any points to the adult victim survivor? Alf, are you muted?
Apologies again. I can't think of anything to add to that. I'm sorry, but I think everything was pretty much covered similar.
I think perhaps that you made that really excellent point about this particular situation with Kylie. And I just want to pick up on that, that we really need to be respectful of her desires and make sure she knows that we're respectful. That was a really good point that Alf made. Thank you. Now, adult persons using violence. Stephen, can you start this conversation?
Yeah, so we had two questions to look at, and very much the first one was, how do we support Craig's parents? And it was really just a case of kind of going through the different scenarios, both in terms of what their fear is, the fear of consequences and escalation, and bringing that back to the present concerns and future concerns, which are safety, you know, for themselves, and their fear of the potential consequences, escalating consequences, both for Craig as far as, you know, getting him in trouble and violating his community treatment order, but the escalating consequences for them as well. Like if the situation's gotten very serious, he's assaulted his mother, and, you know, the potential for that, as currently unchecked, if left unchecked, to get, you know, worse in the future. So we talked about, you know, what we can do to support them. Someone had a really good suggestion about preemptively talking to local law enforcement if they are called out. It probably would be a single police station that would be responding most times. So finding supports as far as connecting with them preemptively and safety planning there. And also perhaps trying to connect his parents to a support group of individuals in similar situations, families of people who are affected this way by family violence, and how to support them.
Terrific. Thanks for that, Steve. And Belle, did you want to add anything?
Well, just a little bit about, it was a very conflicting emotional time for them, and how to really give more support to the carers, the family. Really good that, we understand, empathise with their journey, but also the safety as well. And also, just in understanding that we quite understand that, concerned about police maybe arriving and the neighbours and all of this. So it's just more supporting them.
Yeah, terrific. Okay, handing it back now to Pauline. Pauline?
I'm here. So I just wanted to, and I'm not sure where we are on about vicarious trauma. I just wanted to talk a bit about self-care before we finish. Now, where would that be? Here we go. So I just want to, and as a group, we're very conscious that these are difficult subjects, and that they're subjects that we're also potentially affected by. So remembering as clinicians and people working with other humans, that vicarious trauma is a cumulative effect of working with trauma. So it usually develops over time and can help happen to anyone. It can impact the professional and personal life of a worker. Symptoms for ourselves we need to be aware of is anxiety, depression, irritability, low energy, sleep disturbance, social withdrawal. And we need to remind ourselves that working with people who have experienced family violence or have perpetrated family violence can be very stressful for us. And therefore, it's very important to look after ourselves and to think about our self-care, think about our supervision arrangements and how we support ourselves as workers. That's pretty much it, Bronwyn. So we're happy to take questions if we've got time, or...
You certainly have, yeah.
Okay.
I'm just going to move forward. Oh, there's your service.
That's okay. And look, some of these are not, I needed to change some of these, but Eastern Casa is our area. But I suppose what the message is that there are many services in the community that are supporting children, people who are affected by family violence, and those using family violence. That's pretty much it, Ron.
Fantastic. All right. So guys, if you want to go to your Slido now, now one of the problems I have is because we don't, our Slido moderator is unable to be here today, I'm doing it all. So what I'm going to ask you to do is put in your questions now, and then I can approve the questions quickly. And then I will, so go into your Slido, and I'll approve all the questions that come through, and then we'll go straight into it. In fact, I might even be able to take the moderation off, so you can just pop your questions in while I'm working on the Slido.
Hi, Bronwyn. Also at Bondawan Willam, we offer secondary consult around family violence in Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander families.
Thank you, Emma.
Yes, we missed the deadline to fix that slide up at the end. It's supposed to say EDVOS and ECASA.
And BWAS?
Yes, and BWAS, as you've just pointed out.
Is there any chance of going back to the previous slide so we can have another look at that, please?
Which slide?
I'll do it. There, that one.
Yep, thanks.
There's lots of missing things, is what I'm saying. So this is, if we're thinking about the Eastern region, we'd be thinking about Eastern Casa. We now have the orange door in the inner east, which will be coming to the outer east hopefully next year. Emma, did you want to briefly talk about your service, why we've got you here?
Oh, hi. I'll put my foot in it now.
Well, we'll take advantage of it.
Very handy.
Yep.
As I said, we're Bondawan Willam our acronyms BWAHS, BWAHS, if anyone wants to look us up, and just call the office number. And if you would like to ask for a secondary consult, or if you're working with either victim survivors or users of violence, we have a men's team and a women's team who are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, obviously, either they or their partner. So we can be flexible with if there's an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person in the family, then we will work with the whole family. So feel free to call us or email us. We do family services as well as family violence case management, AOD counselling, women's counselling, children and youth counselling as well.
Thank you. If you've got a minute to put it in the chat, then maybe a contact, and maybe people can have a look at it.
Okay, Pauline, thank you. Thanks, Emma. That was great. Yeah, if you can put your address in the chat, I'll be able to send that on to people as well, but people can copy it out. So can you explain more about IVO being placed on the perpetrator by the police and how they are different? There are differing stipulations.
And I'm more than happy, Rosie and Kate, to please jump in. When police attend an incident, they can take out an IVO on the spot to support the family. This legislation changed about 20 years ago, and it will place conditions on the person using violence. So they become the respondent of the IVO, while the people who are the victims become the affected family members. The conditions at that point are usually because of what the police have seen, so that police can only act by what they've seen. So if it's a particularly physical violent situation, they may actually put it as a full exclusion IVO, which means that, excuse me, the person using violence can't be in the home. Excuse me. What happens is then in usually a fortnight, that goes before the magistrate, and that gives both parties an opportunity to think about what conditions that they would prefer on that intervention order. In saying that, the police will also present their brief in the sense of what violence might be occurring. What we know about family violence is that often victims are fearful of the person using violence, and therefore may not, talk to the magistrate about all the fears that are occurring. There's various conditions. One might be as simple as you cannot commit family violence, and it will list the various, a bit like the slide I showed you where the legal definition of what family violence is. It might say that you can't communicate with the victim survivor, or you can't be within 200 metres of the victim survivor. And recently we've seen IVOs that have been stipulating the condition that the person can have contact, but they can't have contact if they're alcohol or substance affected. For Rosie, Kate and I, who are often trying to safety plan with these type of intervention orders, it's really making things difficult because it's putting the onus back on the affected family member to observe and define whether the person's affected by alcohol or drugs, and then actually telling that person potentially to go away, or you can't come in. I don't like these IVOs. I'm sure Rosie can comment as well. They're really difficult.
Yeah, we've just seen a pattern recently of these IVOs, and I'm not sure if there's been a change of magistrate, but I've never come across as many with this alcohol and drug condition. So difficult for somebody to be able to safety plan around that, because it could actually escalate their risk if they were to say, no, you can't come in, you're alcohol and drug affected. So yeah, a tricky one to work with. And we'd like to feed that back to the Magistrates Court, actually. There's also been some other odd conditions that you sometimes get as well, where it's like they can only come over if you provide permission to that person. But if that person's very manipulative and they're using threats, it's going to be a bit hard to say no. So that's also another difficult one that we sometimes see.
And that'll often say the person, again, it's putting the decision or the onus back on the affected family member. So, you know, it'll say the condition is something about provide written permission, they can come over. So that might look like a text message or, but what we know about family violence and the controlling and the coercive behaviour, that's a very difficult position to put family members in. I hope that sort of answers the question.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you so much. Looks like we've only got the one question for you guys today. Oh, here we go. One more. Can you provide guidance on how to support a survivor where the perpetrator or the person who chooses to use the violence is using the system to continue their abuse, such as the family court system? That's a complex one, I guess. Anybody out of our amazing team of specialists would like to have a crack at it?
Sure. Absolutely. System abuse occurs regularly, and we do see this in the family law space. A lot of work has been occurring in family law to have a space where victims and persons using violence have their voice heard, and the impact on the children and the children having their voice heard. But I think there's a lot of work that needs to continue in that space. Everyone's entitled to legal advice and to gather your evidence. The Safe and Together training particularly talks about how, even as professionals, and particularly as professionals, how we document and how we use our language. So where we might say that the mother couldn't get the child to the swimming lessons because he wouldn't provide the money, shifting that language around that because of his controlling behaviours, he's withholding money, which is actually impacting on the child's development. So our language is really important, particularly if our notes are then used in the law in family court. And I think it pushes that language back to that the person using violence is in control of their violence, but how do we assist a victim survivor or a mother to how do we to shift that language so that the court can understand what he's doing or what the person using violence is doing? Does that sort of make sense? Do you want to add to that, Rosie?
Yeah, I think when it comes to systems abuse, it's a form of coercive control quite often. It can be subtle. It can be things like constantly adjourning dates and escalating the price of the overall family court issue and it costing a lot over a long period of time. So again, yes, using the right language to assist that person to understand what's going on and making sure that they're able to keep record of what's going on as well, perhaps using a diary. There's also the ARC app, which you can download from DVRCV, which can be a helpful way to capture somebody's story, because they will have to put that in an affidavit at some point if they're going to family court. So that's one way to help them to bring it all together. And also just having thorough legal advice to get through that situation. We've got someone here from ECLC as well, who I'm sure would also be able to help with that situation as a family violence service within ECLC. So yeah, there are lots of options with helping to support somebody through that process, and really offering maybe to be a support person at court, because it can be such an overwhelming experience on the day, or referring them to court network support.
And just lastly, in relation to the last question, would it be more appropriate to refer the victim to Family Violence Service or a community legal centre, do you think?
I think both. Yeah, why not both? And a family violence service will do a referral to a legal service anyway, if that's one of the needs. So they've got links to that.
All right, terrific. Thank you all for fabulous presentations today. I just wanted to wrap up the workshop now, as we've come to the end of our time, unfortunately. I particularly want to thank everybody who's participated today. It wouldn't be a workshop without our amazing participants and groups of discussion. Want to thank all our presenters. They've all done a fabulous job of explaining really complex scenarios around mental illness and co-occurring issues. And would like to particularly thank Tom Lucky for all his hard work in the tech area today, getting the breakouts going, making sure people got in and keeping a record of who was attending. And the EMSCA Implementation Committee members for facilitating the breakout rooms and also developing the event and largely putting the event on. We also have some financial support from Eastern Health, Eastern Melbourne PHN, and the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing, so we can provide these events for free. And next year, we hope to be back in the Box Hill Town Hall doing it live. So look forward to that. Just to remind you all of the EMSCA website, if you go to the EMSCA website, you can keep an eye on the calendar of events, and events come up periodically. We should be putting on a collaborative care planning workshop, which is our kind of signature annual event, or one of our signature annual events, in March next year. And in May, we're planning to do our great big town hall service collective, where everyone gets together and we talk through the sectors and orient everybody to them. So thank you again for joining us. Please take a moment now to complete the feedback survey in the Slido. It's really important that we get your feedback, and we even adjusted today's program based on feedback from last week. So we try to be really responsive to that. Thanks, folks. See you next time.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.